The Emperor's light is said to never fade, burning eternal across the void. But beneath Hive's cineris, it feels thin, like smoke. Holy sigils crumble, prayers fade, and Vox preachers' voices tremble, not with devotion, but doubt. It started with whispers, missing rations, absent priests, desecrated altars. Workers refused to kneel. Faith, the Imperium's backbone, began to rot from within. I watched the Underhive go dark, chants twisted into hollow echoes. The city that prayed through plague and war forgot its own salvation. Faith gone leaves a silence deadlier than any Xenos, a silence where new gods are born.
The lower hive of Cineris never knew true daylight. Even before the faith began to fail, the air here was a thick soup of soot and sweat, the lumens forever dimmed by centuries of unclean smoke. The walls were alive with the sound of the city breathing, the slow pulse of pipes, the whine of gears, the distant thunder of upper levels grinding against the endless weight of their own existence. To live here was to live beneath a mountain made of humanity's waste, and to call it holy. Father Keldron's chapel sat at the edge of Sump Corridor 19, where the floor sagged beneath centuries of corrosion, and the air smelled of rusted iron and oil. It had once been a proper sanctum, banners hanging from the rafters, candles burning in orderly lines, incense thick enough to hide the cracks in the walls. But now the banners were rags, the candles stolen long ago, and the air carried only the bitter stench of burnt promethium from the manufactorum vents above. Still, every night the faithful came. Not many, just enough to fill the front rows, their faces drawn and hollow, their eyes reflecting the dull orange glow of the emergency lumen that flickered over the pulpit. Keldron spoke through a crack Vox amplifier strapped to his chest, its grill warped by age. His words wavered like heat distortion, but they still carried meaning, or at least the memory of it. "The Emperor watches," he said, voice low but steady. "Even when the light cannot reach us, his gaze does not falter. We are the embers that refuse to die." No one answered. There had been a time when they would have wept at his words, shouted praises, or pressed their foreheads to the floor. Now, they just sat in silence, their bodies still, but their hands twitching, as if remembering the motion of prayer and finding it suddenly meaningless. A child began to cough in the back. The sound echoed through the metal beams like a shot. Keldron paused, and for a heartbeat, he imagined he could hear the Emperor's voice behind it, a whisper caught in the static of his Vox. But it was only feedback. He continued, forcing the words from his throat as if they were stones. "Faith is not ease. Faith is hunger. It is the wound that proves we live." When the sermon ended, no one lingered. They left as they always did, silent, heads down, shuffling into the haze outside. Keldron watched them go until only the sound of his own breathing remained. He turned off the Vox and pressed a trembling hand to his chest. His heart felt like a rusted gear grinding against itself. He had once believed the Emperor spoke to him in dreams. That was before the shipment stopped, before the Ecclesiarch's envoys ceased their visits, before even the local Adeptus Arbites stopped patrolling the corridors, before the faith itself began to rot in the air. Now, all he heard in the quiet hours was the hum of the dying lumen and the creak of the pipes above, leaking water the color of blood. That night, as Keldron extinguished the last of the altar candles, one of the few relics left untouched, he noticed a mark scratched into the stone beneath it. A circle, drawn with careful precision, and at its center, a symbol he didn't recognize. A spiral, curling inward until it vanished into a single point. He stared at it for a long moment, running a finger along its edges. It felt fresh, carved recently. Outside, the wind howled through the broken vents like a living thing. Somewhere deep in the sump levels below, machinery screamed, then fell silent. Keldrin knelt before the altar and tried to pray, but the words refused to form. His throat constricted, and what came out instead was a whisper he did not recognize as his own. "If you still watch, my lord, then why can I no longer feel you?" The lumen above flickered once, twice, and went dark. In the pitch-black silence, something exhaled. Not a machine, not a pipe, something slow, steady, and near. Keldrin froze, his hand groping for the auspex lantern beside the pulpit. The sound stopped. Then from the darkness came a faint voice, soft, feminine, and impossibly close. "Because you already know the answer." The light snapped back on with a buzz. The chapel was empty. The mark on the stone was gone. Keldrin sat alone for a long time, his breath trembling, his mind trying to convince itself that he had simply imagined it, another hallucination born of hunger and exhaustion. But deep down, beneath the layers of reason and ritual, he felt something move, a new kind of awareness, patient and watching. Outside, the lower hive groaned. Somewhere far above, the bells of the upper levels began to toll, late, uneven, and hollow.
The next morning, the air in Sump Corridor 19 was heavier than usual, carrying the acrid tang of smoldering promethium from the manufactoria above. Keldrin moved through it cautiously, his boots clanking on rusted metal grates, eyes scanning the shadowed corners for signs of life, or signs of death. The city had become a place of half-shapes and whispers. Every corner held a story of disappearance or decay, and every story was marked with the same hollow question. If the Emperor does not intervene, then what is left for those who remain? He passed a group of children huddled around a leaking vent, their faces smeared with soot and unwashed filth, eyes wide and too old for their age. One of them reached out with trembling hands, offering a scrap of bread wrapped in stained cloth. Keldrin accepted it with a nod, aware that the gesture was both gift and accusation. The city had become a place where charity was a confession, the acknowledgement that survival had outstripped devotion. The manufactorium above roared like a beast in pain. Pistons thudded and gears ground as the Skitarii moved in coordinated silence, their ceramite plates streaked with oil, their red robes dulled by dust. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus, whose faith in machine was as rigid as the Emperor's in Terra, had begun to look away from the Underhive. Their prayers were muffled, their chants hollow, as if the machinery itself was absorbing what little devotion remained and turning it to ash. Keldrin remembered the last time he had tried to speak with a Magos. The man's eyes had not seen him. They had looked past him into something only the machine spirit can understand. He entered the narrow stairwell that led to the heart of the lower hive, where the sound of life was a mixture of coughing, wheezing, and quiet sobs. At the bottom, the walls were slick with condensation and oil, and the floor vibrated with the resonance of machinery so old it might as well have been breathing. It was here, in this claustrophobic underworld, that the city's faith had begun to crumble first. Here, the faithful had begun to whisper doubt, small, dangerous words muttered between shifts over vats of fermenting synth meat, over the grinding of pistons and conveyor belts. Keldrin stopped in front of a small alcove carved into the stone, its interior lined with broken statues and flaking mural paint. Someone had left a candle burning here, and beneath it was a crudely drawn symbol, almost identical to the one from the chapel, a spiral curling inward until it vanished. His hand hovered over it, shaking, yet unable to turn away. He felt the same presence from the night before, patient and observing, and for a moment the sound of the manufactorium fell away entirely. He felt the pulse of the city itself, not the pulse of the hob or the machinery, but something deeper, a rhythm born of forgotten prayers and abandoned rites. A voice whispered again, this time clearer, threading through the clang of pistons. They are watching, as you are. Keldrin's pulse quickened. He spun around, but the alcove was empty.
The children gone, the vent steam curling lazily into nothingness. He spoke aloud, though his own voice felt alien. "Who is there?" Only silence answered, and then, faint as a sigh, he heard it. The sound of feet that did not belong to man, moving deliberately over stone. A shiver ran down his spine. Every instinct, honed over decades of devotion, screamed at him to retreat, to flee. But the curiosity that had haunted him since the first mark appeared rooted him to the spot. He took a deep breath and whispered a prayer, though he no longer knew to whom. The words had become ritual without meaning, a thread connecting him to a faith that might have already died. "Show me what must be seen, that I may still serve." The spiral on the wall shimmered faintly, like oil catching the dying light of a distant lumens, and for an instant he could see movement within it, shapes twisting, human and inhuman at once. The whisper came again, carried on the vibration of the corridor. Faith dies, and something else takes its place. He fell to his knees, not in surrender, but in recognition, a tremor passing through him as he felt the first real fear in years. It was not fear of death, nor of the hive collapsing under Prometheum fire or stardation. It was fear of emptiness, the realization that the city's devotion had already turned inward, leaving nothing but echoes. And in those echoes, something waited. Above him, the bells tolled again, unevenly, the sound shattering the quiet like a blade. Caldron's gaze lifted. The light from the upper hive had never seemed so distant, so unreachable. Even the Astra Militarum, stationed in the corridors above to keep order, would not hear the cries of the lower levels. This was a place beyond reprieve, beyond the reach of command or doctrine. It existed solely to remember what humanity had abandoned. And in that memory, Cauldron knew he was the last to speak aloud what remained, the last to call the faithful back to prayer. Because beyond him, beyond the alcoves and the broken manufactoria, the whispers were spreading, and faith, fragile as it always was, would never be the same.
Caldron remained on his knees long after the bells had ceased, the echo of their hollow toll lingering in his ears like a pulse. The lower hive around him seemed to contract and expand with every heartbeat, each corridor and grate a living, breathing thing that remembered centuries of devotion and centuries of decay. He rose slowly, feeling the weight of the city press against his shoulders, and moved toward the chapel's exit. Every step sent a shiver up his spine, a reminder that the darkness here was not merely absence of light, but the absence of certainty itself. The corridor opened onto a wider sump-level plaza where the last of the Hab units stood. Their walls, streaked with rust and neglect, bore the faded sigils of the Imperium, painted generations ago and long since ignored. Children ran barefoot over cracked metal plates, scavenging scraps from abandoned servitor frames, their laughter a brittle echo that contrasted sharply with the deep groan of machinery. Caldron's gaze lingered on them, and he saw the truth he had tried to deny. Survival had become their only religion. A group of workers clustered near a broken vent, trading ration scraps in hushed voices. Caldron approached, his presence acknowledged but unremarked upon. Here, the veneer of reverence had peeled away completely, leaving only pragmatic barter and wary eyes. One of the workers, a man with the gaunt face of someone who had lost decades to labor and despair, spoke first. "The priests can't save us anymore. Even the Vox preachers say the light is weak." Caldron's heart clenched. These were the words that had haunted his sleepless nights, the fear that gnawed at the edges of every prayer. He opened his mouth to reply, to remind them that the Emperor's gaze is eternal, that the Astromonicon shines even when it feels distant. But the words faltered, breaking against the raw, unflinching reality of the lower hive. He moved on, ascending a narrow shaft that led toward the manufactorium access. The smell of hot promethium and burning metal thickened with each step. Sparks danced over the grated flooring, reflecting in the corroded pipes like dying stars in a polluted sky. The Skitarii passed without acknowledgement, their red robes dulled by smoke, their augmetic eyes reflecting nothing human. Even they seemed to feel the change in the air, the slow decay of the devotion that had once fueled every cog, every piston. Caldron paused at the heart of the manufactorium. The assembly lines had slowed, more out of exhaustion than lack of fuel. Servitors slumped against conveyors, their limbs rusted and wires frayed. The machines whined with uneven rhythm, as though mourning the absence of those who had maintained them. And yet, beneath all of it, there was a pattern. Subtle, almost imperceptible, a pulse that thrummed beneath metal and stone alike. It was as if the city itself were alive, aware, and waiting. Caldron knelt beside one of the servitors, brushing away grime to reveal a set of clawed hands carefully arranged over a data slate. There, etched into the metal in the unmistakable symbol he had seen before, was another symbol, a quiet, deliberate message left by hands that were no longer entirely human. The whisper returned, now a thought as much as a voice. Faith runs dry, and something rises. His head dropped, the weight of the realization pressing him into the floor. He had spent decades maintaining ritual and obedience, preaching devotion to those who had little left to give. Now, in the Underhive's quiet heart, he understood the truth. Faith had not merely faltered, it had abandoned them, and in its absence, something new, or perhaps ancient, or perhaps not yet named, had begun to grow. The lights flickered again, and in their intermittent glow he saw movement in the shadows, figures he could not fully comprehend, humanoid but stretched, angular, their presence more suggestion than substance. The voice, now insistent, circled him like smoke. Observe and do not interfere. The city will teach what the Emperor cannot. Caldron rose slowly, brushing dirt from his robes, and looked up at the towering shafts that led toward the upper hive. There, distant and unreachable, the bells tolled again, uneven, hollow, a reminder that the world above remained oblivious to the quiet rot below. And yet, in the lower hive, something fundamental had shifted. The machinery continued to grind, the children scavenged, the Skitarii worked, and Caldron, last of the speaking priests, carried a new knowledge. The hive no longer prayed. It watched, and it waited. As he stepped back into the corridors, the whisper faded, leaving only the low hum of the manufactorium. His eyes fell upon the mark on the floor, a spiral, now glowing faintly in the dim lumen. He pressed his hand against it, feeling the pulse beneath the stone, and knew with certainty that he had crossed a threshold. There would be no turning back. The lower hive had begun to learn its own language, one written in fear, hunger, and the first stirrings of a devotion, entirely its own. The city above the lower hive moved with a rhythm that had once been dictated by devotion, bells, chants, and the measured march of the faithful. Now, the rhythm had shifted. The streets of the mid-hive, once filled with pilgrimages and processions, were quieted by a different kind of fear. People walked with heads down, eyes darting to corners where shadows thickened unnaturally, avoiding the familiar symbols of the ecclesiarchy as if they had become threats rather than guides. The air smelled of ash, sweat, and old promethium, mingling with the faint tang of blood where disputes over rationed food had already turned deadly. Caldron moved through it, his robes catching on metal posts, his eyes scanning the faces of the passing crowd. The faithful were thinner now, their eyes hollow with the realization that devotion could not protect them. Some whispered prayers, but their mouths moved mechanically, rehearsed words that no longer carried belief. The bells rang overhead, uneven, muffled by the smoke and dust of the lower levels, and in their hollow resonance, Caldron heard something entirely new, the echo of doubt. He passed the great cathedral of the mid-hive, its spires blackened and cracked. The statues of saints had been defaced, faces scraped, hands broken, inscriptions scratched away in the obsessive gestures of desperation. Inside, a small cluster of pilgrims knelt, their heads bowed, but their murmurs were not prayers. They spoke of warmth, of safety, of promises made by strangers with voices carried through the Vox channels, who claimed that the Emperor's gaze was no longer required. Caldron recognized the danger immediately, the first seeds of heresy, disguised as comfort, taking root in the hearts of the desperate. Children ran through the plaza, their bare feet silent on the metal floor. They carried fragments of candles, trinkets or scraps of rationed synth meat, and their laughter had the hollow ring of something learned too young, mimicry of joy without understanding it. From above, the upper hive glimmered faintly through the vents, a distant reminder that the Imperium still existed somewhere, even if it had abandoned them in spirit. Caldron felt a pang of anger and sorrow, a reminder that faith is never merely personal, it is woven into the machinery of society, and when it dies, the entire construct begins to crumble. Processions, once the lifeblood of devotion, had begun to hollow. The clerics of the mid-hive, their faces drawn and masks of devotion slipping, had stopped leading the faithful. Vox preachers repeated the same old sermons, but their voices trembled, carried not authority but uncertainty. The people followed them like marionettes whose strings had frayed, moving through the streets in patternless disorder. Caldron observed the movement from the edge of the plaza, noting how the rituals had lost their meaning, leaving only repetition without comprehension. Even the incense burned differently, a sharp, acrid smoke that stung the eyes rather than soothing them, a reflection of the city's corrupted spirit. In a small side street, he found a group of citizens kneeling before a desecrated shrine. A priest had attempted to restore it, but the fragments of scripture and holy relics were scattered, broken, trampled underfoot by a populace whose needs now outweighed their devotion. Caldron knelt beside them, silently observing. He saw fear in their eyes. Fear not of punishment or damnation, but of emptiness, of a universe indifferent to their prayers. One of the women raised a trembling hand to him, her lips moving in a silent plea. He knew that she no longer sought the emperor, but something entirely else. Reassurance, warmth, and safety in a world that had forgotten both. Above, the chiming bells rang again, uneven and discordant. The Vox channels crackled with distorted hymns that repeated over and over, a mechanical echo of devotion with all meaning stripped away. He could feel it pressing into the minds of the people, eroding what little faith remained. The hollow procession moved forward, through smoke and dust, ritual without purpose, devotion without understanding, and everywhere he looked, he felt the presence of that same spiral symbol etched on walls, floors, and metal supports, a quiet, persistent mark, as if the city itself were reshaping the faith in its own image. Caldron realized he was no longer an observer. He had become a participant in something new, something that the Imperium could neither sanction nor understand. The people did not kneel for the emperor. They moved, they whispered, they existed, but they no longer prayed. In their faces, he saw the shadow of what was to come, a devotion divorced from doctrine, a faith born not of command or scripture, but of necessity and survival.